How did an IQ test ruin my life? I only took the IQ test because they were paying $50 and I needed gas money. I was a solid C student with a school counselor who literally told me to consider clown college, so my expectations were pretty low. The test itself wasn't even that hard, which should have been my first warning. I finished in 40 minutes when they'd said it would take 2 hours. The proctor looked confused when I handed it in and asked if I was giving up. I said no, I'd answered everything, and she made this face like she didn't believe me. 20 minutes later, 3 researchers rushed into the waiting room looking at me like I'd just solved world hunger. The lead researcher said there must have been a scoring error and asked me to take a different version. I said sure as long as I still got paid, because gas prices weren't getting any lower while we stood there. This one felt even easier somehow, and I finished in 35 minutes. The researchers were whispering frantically in the corner, and one kept staring at me like I might spontaneously combust. The lead researcher came over and said, "You just scored 198 on the Stanford Binet, which puts you above the 99th percentile. I laughed because that was the funniest thing I'd heard all week. She wasn't joking, and suddenly everyone wanted to study me. They brought in specialists who made me take 5 more IQ tests. Every single score came back between 195 and 210, which apparently meant I was smarter than Einstein. I told them Einstein probably knew what year World War II ended, and I'd just failed that history quiz yesterday. My parents were called in for a meeting where the researchers used words like profound genius and once-in-a-generation intellect, while my mom kept saying there must be some mistake. She reminded them I'd once tried to microwave aluminum foil and nearly burned down our kitchen. They said genius manifests in mysterious ways, and I said yeah, like getting D's in physics. MIT called our house offering me early admission with a full scholarship. Harvard wanted to fly me out for a special program. The local news wanted to do a story about the small-town genius nobody had noticed. My principal suddenly acted like we were best friends, even though last week he'd called me Brian when my name is Mark, but nothing had changed about my actual intelligence. I still couldn't understand calculus, and honestly wasn't even sure what calculus was for. When they gave me advanced problems to solve, I just stared at them wondering if this was how my dog felt when I tried to explain why he couldn't eat chocolate. The researchers couldn't explain it either. They tested me for everything from photographic memory to hidden savant syndrome. My brain scans showed completely average activity. When they asked me to explain my thought process for solving the test problems, I couldn't, because I'd literally just picked whatever felt right, like choosing lottery numbers. My teachers started treating me differently, expecting brilliant insights I couldn't provide. They'd call on me for the hardest questions, and I'd sit there like a deer in headlights. My classmates either avoided me or tried to get me to do their homework, which was hilarious because I was copying off other people myself. The testing got more invasive and honestly pretty weird. They hooked me up to machines while I took tests and monitored my brain waves. They took blood samples and did genetic testing looking for mutations. One researcher was convinced I was unconsciously accessing collective intelligence, and I asked him if that meant I was basically using cosmic Wi-Fi. I started refusing to take more tests, but the pressure intensified. The school threatened to sue my parents if I didn't participate in their gifted program. Researchers showed up at our house uninvited, including one who tried to collect my garbage for DNA samples. Someone leaked my scores online, and conspiracy theorists started saying I was everything from an alien hybrid to a Russian experiment. Then I overheard 2 researchers arguing about my case. One said the scores were impossible given my academic history, which, yeah, no kidding. The other said they'd tested me in isolation with different proctors, and the scores stayed consistent. Then she mentioned something that made me actually pay attention for once. She said they'd found 3 other cases exactly like mine in different states. Average students who suddenly scored impossibly high, but showed no other signs of genius. All of them had started within the same 2-week period, and all described picking answers that just felt right, without knowing why. I went home and searched for the other students. They looked as confused as me in their photos, with headlines calling them hidden geniuses. But I noticed something the articles didn't mention. We'd all taken the same viral personality quiz 2 months ago from some sketchy website my friend had shared. I still had the confirmation email from the quiz. The site was gone, but the domain was registered to something called the Cognitive Enhancement Institute. I found one archived forum post that said Phase 1 subjects identified and marked for extraction, which sounded like something from a bad sci-fi movie I'd probably fail to understand. My phone rang with an unknown number. When I answered, a voice said, "We know you figured it out," and gave me an address. I said, "Figured what out, because I literally don't understand anything that's happening," but they'd already hung up. I grabbed a pen and wrote the address on my hand before the numbers faded from my memory. My hand was shaking, which made my already bad handwriting look worse. The address was for some place downtown, which could mean anything from a coffee shop to an abandoned building. I started pacing around my room trying to figure out if going there would be the stupidest thing I'd ever done, or just top 5. My mom walked in without knocking like always, and saw me walking back and forth staring at my hand. She asked what was wrong, and I tried to play it off, but she knows all my tells. I ended up telling her everything about the phone call, because keeping secrets from her never works anyway. Her face went through about 6 different expressions in 10 seconds. She immediately went into protective mode and grabbed her phone to call Dad at work. She told him to come home right away because we needed to discuss this as a family. Dad tried to ask questions, but she just kept saying he needed to get here now. While we waited for him, I showed her the address, and she looked it up on her phone. The building had multiple businesses listed, so we couldn't tell what it actually was. Dad got home in 20 minutes, which was a record from his office. Mom explained everything while I sat there feeling like a little kid in trouble. Dad thought we should at least hear what they had to say since they already knew where we lived anyway. Mom was convinced it was either a scam or something dangerous and wanted to call the police. They went back and forth for an hour, while I mostly stayed quiet. We finally agreed I could go, but only with strict rules about safety. That night I barely slept thinking about what could happen. The next morning, I woke up to 3 emails from the school, all marked urgent. They were threatening consequences if I didn't participate in their gifted program immediately. The emails used words like legal obligation and truancy, which seemed extreme for someone who couldn't even spell truancy without autocorrect. One email said they'd already enrolled me in advanced placement, everything starting Monday. Another threatened to report my parents for educational neglect if they didn't comply. The third one was from the principal personally asking me to reconsider for the good of the school's reputation. I showed my parents the emails over breakfast, and Mom got that look that meant someone was about to get an earful. She called the school and asked to speak to the principal directly. I could hear her voice getting louder even from upstairs where I'd retreated. At the school that day, I kept my head down and tried to act normal. During lunch, I sat in the library with my phone searching for the other students mentioned in the articles. I found Clara Torres on social media after checking 3 different platforms. Her profile was mostly private, but her bio mentioned she was from Arizona. I spent 10 minutes writing and rewriting a message to her. I explained who I was and asked if she'd dealt with anything similar to what I was going through. I tried not to sound completely crazy, but probably failed. I mentioned the personality quiz hoping that would prove I wasn't just some random weirdo. After sending it, I immediately regretted it and spent the rest of lunch worried she'd block me. That night, someone posted my test scores on Reddit in one of those conspiracy theory subs. The post had a sensational title about secret geniuses being discovered across America. Within hours, I had hundreds of messages from all kinds of people. Some were researchers wanting to study me and offering money for interviews. Others were conspiracy theorists with theories about everything from alien DNA to government mind control experiments. One guy was absolutely convinced I was his reincarnated grandfather and sent me 20 messages with proof. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications from people I'd never met. I turned off all my social media notifications and put my phone on silent, but the messages kept coming. Someone had even found my school email and flooded it with questions about my abilities. The next day, I decided to go to the address, but set ground rules with my parents first. We agreed on daytime only, and it had to be a public place with people around. I would text them the exact location when I got there and check in every 30 minutes. Dad wanted to come with me, but I convinced him to wait in the car nearby instead. The address turned out to be a co-working space downtown in a normal office building. Not the abandoned warehouse my paranoid brain had imagined all night. The lobby had security and signs for different businesses, including tech startups and a yoga studio. I texted my parents that it seemed safe and went up to the 3rd floor. The co-working space was full of people on laptops and having meetings in glass rooms. A guy about 30 walked up and introduced himself as Vaughn Lewis. He wasn't the government agent type I'd expected, but looked more like a tired grad student. He showed me his press credentials from a news website I'd actually heard of. He explained he'd been tracking the Cognitive Enhancement Institute for months after getting a tip about their testing programs. We sat at a table in the corner, where he pulled out a folder full of documents. He showed me emails between the institute and testing companies discussing something called cognitive priming protocols. There were charts showing test score patterns that matched mine exactly. He pointed out sections about using preliminary assessments to create favorable testing conditions. He needed someone who took both the quiz and the IQ tests to help prove the connection. He said I was the first person who'd actually responded to his attempts to reach out. I wasn't sure I trusted him completely, but the documents looked real enough. Right then, my phone buzzed with a message notification from Clara Torres. She'd messaged me back confirming she took the same personality quiz about 2 months before her IQ scores spiked. She'd been dealing with similar pressure from her school and researchers trying to study her. She said she was relieved to find someone else going through this, because everyone thought she was lying about not being a genius. She sent screenshots of her quiz confirmation email that looked exactly like mine. That evening, I went through my email to find the original quiz confirmation while my parents watched TV. I discovered cached data in my browser, showing how my answers were recorded with timestamps and response patterns. The timestamp matched exactly 2 months before my first IQ test down to the day. The sending domain linked back to the Cognitive Enhancement Institute just like I'd found before. Everything was starting to connect in ways that made this whole thing feel less random and more planned. The next morning, my phone started buzzing at 6:30 with texts from the school saying I had a mandatory meeting at 10 and attendance was required. My mom read the message over my shoulder while making coffee and immediately grabbed her phone to call in sick to work. She drove me to the school muttering about how they couldn't just demand meetings without proper notice, but we both knew they'd find a way to make it stick. The meeting was in the principal's office with him, the guidance counselor, and 2 people from the district I'd never seen before. They had folders spread across the desk with my name on tabs, and one of the district people started talking about my obligation to the school community. She said my test scores meant I had a responsibility to participate in their advanced placement program, starting immediately. I asked if I could record the conversation on my phone for my parents, and the principal actually reached over and put his hand on my phone saying that wouldn't be necessary. My mom stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor and said we were leaving if they wouldn't let us document the meeting. The district woman said leaving would be considered truancy and could have serious consequences for my academic standing. They spent 20 minutes going back and forth about requirements and obligations, while I sat there thinking about how I still had a C- in chemistry. The principal kept saying this was an opportunity, while my mom kept asking what would happen if I said no. Nobody would give her a straight answer, which made her angrier with each dodge. They finally let us leave after making us sign a paper saying we'd been informed of the meeting's content, though my mom wrote "signed under protest" next to her name. That night, I heard my parents in the kitchen having their first real fight in months about what to do. Dad kept saying we should just go along with it for now to avoid making enemies at the school, since I still had 2 years left. Mom slammed a cabinet and said she wasn't letting them treat me like some kind of lab experiment just because of weird test scores. Dad said fighting the school would make my life harder, and Mom said letting them do whatever they wanted would be worse. They went around in circles for an hour with Dad trying to find middle ground and Mom getting more protective with each suggestion. I put my headphones on, but could still hear them through the music. The next day at the school was worse than anything since the scores went public. Kids surrounded me at my locker asking me to solve random math problems they'd found online. Someone shoved a Rubik's Cube at me saying a genius should solve it in seconds. A group of seniors wanted me to predict their SAT scores based on their GPAS. I kept saying I didn't know how to do any of that, but they just laughed like I was being modest. By lunch, I couldn't take it anymore and went to eat in my car in the parking lot. Even there, kids knocked on my windows holding up their homework and making stupid faces. I drove to a gas station just to eat my sandwich in peace. That afternoon, I sat at my desk and made a list trying to organize everything I actually knew for sure. The list was pathetically short. Took a quiz 2 months ago, scored high on IQ tests, couldn't explain the answers, found 3 other kids with the same pattern, quiz linked to Cognitive Enhancement Institute, someone called knowing I'd figured something out. Everything else was just guessing and paranoia. The facts barely filled half a page even with my terrible handwriting. I added question marks next to things I suspected, but couldn't prove, like the quiz being designed to affect test answers. Looking at it all written out made me realize how little control I had over any of this. The next morning, walking to the school, I kept checking behind me, convinced someone was following. Every car that slowed down made me walk faster. A woman walking the same direction for 3 blocks had me ready to run. Then I recognized Mrs. Clay from down the street walking her ancient poodle like she did every morning. She waved and asked how my mom was doing, and I felt stupid for being so paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away even after I knew it was just my neighbor. I was losing it and needed to do something before I completely cracked. During study hall, I went to the bathroom and called Vaughn from the stall. I asked if he knew any lawyers who could help with the school trying to force me into programs. He said he knew someone named Faye Caldwell, who specialized in educational rights and had dealt with testing controversies before. He texted me her number and said to mention his name when I called. I called her office during lunch, and her assistant set up a meeting for that afternoon. My parents both came with me to Faye's office downtown. She was younger than I expected, with certificates all over her walls and a desk covered in legal pads. She actually listened while I explained everything without interrupting or looking at me like I was crazy. She took notes the entire time and asked specific questions about dates and who said what. When I finished, she explained that schools couldn't force students into programs without proper evaluation and parental consent. She said what they were doing with the pressure and threats was completely inappropriate and possibly illegal. She pulled out a laptop and started typing while explaining my rights under state and federal education laws. For the first time since this started, an adult was treating me like a person instead of a test subject. She said she'd send cease and desist letters to the school and research teams immediately demanding they stop all contact until proper protocols were established. She warned that they might push back harder at first, but the legal protection would force them to follow rules. Her assistant made copies of everything while Faye explained what would happen next. 2 days later, Clara sent me screenshots of the original personality quiz questions she'd saved. We spent an hour comparing them to the IQ test problems I remembered, and the patterns were obvious. The quiz questions about pattern recognition matched exactly with spatial reasoning problems on the IQ test. The word association section lined up with verbal reasoning questions. It was too perfect to be random. Meanwhile, Vaughn was digging into public records and filed requests for any contracts between the testing companies and the institute. He showed me how to properly document everything and keep multiple copies in different places. He said protecting sources and keeping good records were basic journalism skills that apparently I needed now. The school's response to Faye's letter came within a week, and they weren't happy. They pulled me out of drama club and said I couldn't use study hall anymore since I was being non-compliant with academic requirements. The principal called my parents to his office and spent 20 minutes explaining how disappointed he was in my lack of cooperation. My mom sat there taking notes while Dad kept checking his phone and looking annoyed about missing work. Faye got the news within hours and immediately fired off a complaint to the district, calling their actions discriminatory and retaliatory. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. She attached copies of all our previous correspondence and highlighted the parts where they'd threatened us first. The district's legal department got involved, which made everything 10 times more complicated. Meanwhile, the research team reached out through Faye with a new proposal about bringing in someone independent to verify the test results. They wanted to prove the scores were real, but without their direct involvement this time. Faye spent 3 days going back and forth with them about what tests could be used and who would control the data. She made them agree that we'd have full ownership of any results and could decide how they got used. They finally agreed to her terms and suggested a psychometrician named Isabella Rock, who had no connection to their team or the institute. We met Isabella at a neutral testing center downtown that looked like every boring office building ever. She was younger than I expected, with curly hair and glasses that kept sliding down her nose. She actually seemed interested in understanding what happened, rather than proving I was some secret genius. She asked me questions about my school performance and seemed to believe me when I said I was just average. My parents came to the testing session along with Faye, who sat in the corner taking notes on everything. Isabella explained she'd be using completely different materials that couldn't have been compromised or connected to the previous tests. The test took 2 hours and felt nothing like those earlier ones where answers just seemed right somehow. I struggled through every section the way I normally did on tests at the school. I kept second-guessing myself and changing answers, which I never did on those weird IQ tests before. When I finished, Isabella said the results would take a few days to process properly. 3 days later, we got the call to come review the results at her office. The scores were exactly what I'd expected all along, completely average for a high school student. My IQ came back at 102, which put me right in the middle of normal range. Isabella showed us the detailed breakdown, and every section matched my actual academic performance perfectly. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe normally again. Isabella spent another hour going through the original test results, looking for what she called contamination patterns in the data. She pointed out irregularities in the scoring that suggested external factors influenced the results rather than actual ability. She was careful with her words, but clearly thought something fishy had happened with those first tests. She showed us statistical models that demonstrated how certain answer patterns could create false high scores. That same week, Vaughn called me excited about something he'd received from an anonymous source at the institute. Someone had sent him part of an internal presentation about Phase 1 optimization protocols that referenced using preliminary assessments to create favorable testing conditions. The documents were heavily redacted but showed they'd been studying ways to manipulate test outcomes. He was working on verifying the authenticity, but said this could be the smoking gun we needed. 2 days later, I got an encrypted email from someone calling himself Hugh Neff, who claimed to have insider knowledge about the Institute's methods. He wanted to meet at the public library, but had all these weird requirements about security precautions. He said to come alone and sit in the third-floor reference section at exactly 2 p.m. on Tuesday. He'd approach only if he was sure nobody had followed me, which sounded completely paranoid. I showed the email to Vaughn, who said whistleblowers often acted this way when they were scared of retaliation. Tuesday came, and I spent 10 minutes pretending to look at encyclopedias in the reference section, feeling ridiculous. Hugh showed up looking nothing like I expected, just a normal guy in khakis and a polo shirt. He sat down at my table and immediately pulled out a folder full of printed documents and spreadsheets. He explained in a quiet voice that the personality quiz contained specific priming sequences designed to activate pattern recognition in later tests. He showed me code snippets and flowcharts that mapped exactly how the quiz questions prepared people's brains for the IQ test patterns. Then he explained the real kicker, which was a scoring bug in the speed normalization algorithm that could massively inflate scores for people who answered quickly without thinking. He said the Institute knew about the bug, but kept using it because it gave them the results they wanted. The documents showed how answering fast without deliberation could trigger score multipliers that turned average performance into genius-level results. He left me copies of everything and disappeared as quickly as he'd arrived. That night, I couldn't sleep and just lay in bed staring at the ceiling thinking about everything. Part of me had wanted to be special, even though I knew deep down I wasn't. The shame of falling for their manipulation mixed with anger at being used as some kind of experiment. I realized I'd been letting everyone else control this situation while I just went along with whatever happened. It was time to stop being passive and actually do something about this mess. The next morning, Faye showed up at our house with 3 external hard drives and a stack of folders. She made copies of everything we had, including Hugh's documents and the quiz emails and the test results. She uploaded files to secure cloud storage and gave my parents passwords written on paper she said to keep in a safety deposit box. She told us she'd seen too many cases where evidence just disappeared when schools got nervous about lawsuits. While she was organizing everything, the school board sent another letter that arrived by certified mail. They were threatening truancy charges if I kept refusing their gifted program, even though Isabella's tests showed I was completely average. The letter used legal language about mandatory attendance and educational requirements that made my mom's hands shake as she read it. Faye grabbed the letter and immediately started typing on her laptop, drafting an injunction response. She filed it electronically that afternoon, and within 2 hours the district's lawyers were calling her office. The situation was getting way more complicated, with lawyers arguing about jurisdiction and standing and other stuff I didn't understand. That evening, Clara texted me a screenshot of an email she'd gotten from the Institute. They were offering her $20,000 to sign an NDA about her testing experience. The email said the money was for her participation in their research, but the attached document was all about not discussing anything publicly. She'd gotten the same weird high scores I had, and now they wanted to buy her silence. The pattern was obvious, and Faye said this was exactly what guilty organizations did when they were scared. Meanwhile, Isabella was working on something she said would prove Hugh's claims scientifically. She spent 3 days running computer simulations using the scoring algorithm Hugh had described in his documents. She created virtual test takers who answered quickly without thinking, just like we had done. Her models produced scores between 195 and 210, exactly matching what had happened to us. She showed us graphs and charts demonstrating how the bug multiplied scores when someone answered fast without deliberation. The scientific backing made Hugh's whistleblower claims impossible to dismiss as conspiracy theories. Vaughn called that night with his own discovery that connected even more dots. He'd been digging through corporate records and found a partnership memo between the Institute and the test publisher. The memo was dated 6 months before any of us took those IQ tests. It outlined plans for the Institute to use test data to validate their theories about intelligence enhancement. The conflict of interest was right there in black and white, showing they'd rigged the whole system. That weekend, my family sat around the kitchen table for hours, discussing what to do next. Mom kept bringing up concerns about retaliation and what might happen if we went public with everything. Dad worried about my future and whether colleges would hold this against me somehow. But we all agreed that other families deserved to know what had really happened with these tests. We decided to let Vaughn publish his article, but with careful limits on what we'd share. Faye came over again to help us prepare for the media attention that would follow. She made us practice answering questions without speculating about motives or making accusations we couldn't prove. We would stick to facts only and let people draw their own conclusions about the institute's behavior. She gave us a list of phrases to use and ones to avoid when talking to reporters. Vaughn's article went live on Tuesday morning using me as a protected source with a fake name. Anyone at my school could figure out it was me, but at least my name wasn't in print. The article focused on the testing irregularities and included Isabella's data about the scoring bug. He quoted Hugh's documents and mentioned the partnership memo without making direct accusations. Within hours, the article was shared thousands of times on social media. My phone started buzzing with notifications as people found my real social media accounts despite the fake name. Some comments supported us and thanked us for exposing the truth about the tests. Others claimed we were just making excuses because we weren't actually smart enough to maintain those scores. People called us liars and attention seekers and said we were jealous of real geniuses. I spent an hour reading comments before remembering Faye's advice about not engaging with trolls online. I turned on every blocking feature I could find and stopped checking the comments completely. The Institute released their own statement that afternoon trying to control the narrative. They blamed our unusual scores on what they called a rare savant phenomenon that sometimes occurred in testing. They claimed our cases were being studied to better understand these anomalies in human intelligence. Their PR team was clearly working overtime, sending the statement to every news outlet that had covered the story. They tried to discredit our evidence by saying we misunderstood complex psychometric principles. But more people were starting to ask questions about their methods and why multiple students had identical experiences. Reporters were calling the Institute demanding answers about the partnership memo and the scoring algorithm. The story was getting bigger than any of us expected, and the Institute's weak explanations weren't convincing anyone. Hugh called me that night sounding really stressed and asked if we could meet at the coffee shop near campus. When I got there, he was sitting in the corner booth with 3 empty coffee cups already on the table and his laptop open showing lines of code I couldn't understand. He kept rubbing his face and looking around like someone might be watching us, even though the place was mostly empty, except for college kids studying. He told me he'd been thinking about everything nonstop since our library meeting and couldn't sleep knowing what the Institute had done to us. His whole career was built on test development, and if he went public with what he knew, he'd never work in the field again. But he also said watching us fight this thing while he sat on evidence made him feel worse than losing his job ever could. He showed me more internal emails on his laptop, including one where his supervisor explicitly told the team to ignore concerns about the scoring algorithm because fixing it would delay the product launch. I asked what he wanted to do, and he just stared at his coffee for a long time before saying he needed to think about it more. 2 days later, Faye got a call from the state education department saying they were opening an official inquiry into the testing practices after getting complaints from multiple families. She came over that afternoon with boxes of organized documents and helped us understand what information they needed and how to submit everything properly through the official channels. Mom spent hours making copies while Dad labeled everything according to Faye's system so the investigators could easily find what they needed. The department wanted all our test results, the correspondence with researchers, documentation of the school's threats, and any evidence about the connection to the personality quiz. Faye made sure we kept originals of everything and only sent certified copies, so nothing could mysteriously disappear from their files. That same week, Clara texted me a link to the test publisher's website, where they'd posted something called a routine scoring update in tiny text at the bottom of their support page. The update fixed the exact speed normalization bug Hugh had described down to the specific code variables he'd shown us. They claimed it was part of regular maintenance and completely unrelated to any ongoing cases, but the timing was way too perfect to be random. Clara had already screenshot everything before they could delete it and sent copies to Vaughn and Faye for our records. She was getting really good at documenting stuff after everything we'd been through. Clara also started reaching out to the other affected students she'd found through social media and news articles. Within a week, she had 5 of us in a group chat, comparing our experiences and realizing how similar everything was, from the personality quiz to the testing to the pressure from our schools. She suggested we create a joint statement that all of us could sign, explaining what happened and how the pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Everyone agreed, because having multiple voices made it way harder for the Institute to dismiss us as isolated cases or claim we were just looking for attention. We spent 3 nights on video calls drafting the statement with Clara, taking notes, and making sure everyone's experience was included accurately. Meanwhile, several researchers from the original team started sending me private messages through various platforms, apologizing for what happened. They all said basically the same thing about how they'd had concerns, but were pressured by their supervisors to continue the testing program. One researcher wrote this long email about how she knew something was wrong when my scores stayed so high, despite my obvious confusion during the cognitive assessments. Another one said he'd tried to raise concerns in team meetings, but was told to focus on data collection, not interpretation. Their messages were all really careful to avoid saying anything that could get them in legal trouble, but the regret seemed real, even if they weren't willing to go on record about it. Isabella called, asking if she could present our case at an upcoming conference about testing ethics without using our real names. She'd been invited to speak about assessment validity and wanted to use our situation as an example of what happens when profit motives override scientific integrity. We had a family meeting about it and decided to give permission because having respected professionals discussing this might prevent other kids from going through the same thing. She promised to focus on the technical aspects and patterns rather than personal details that could identify us. At the school, most kids still treated me weird, like I was either a fraud or some kind of failed experiment. But during lunch, my friend Jake came up and quietly said he was proud of me for standing up to the system. He said his little brother had learning differences and was constantly being pushed into testing programs that didn't help him at all. It was just one person, but having someone who actually knew me support what we were doing meant more than hundreds of strangers online cheering us on. That evening, Mom and Dad sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and stack of bills looking really worried. Even with Faye's reduced rates, the legal costs were adding up fast, and Dad's insurance only covered so much. Mom kept saying we should keep fighting, but I could see her doing the math on how many extra shifts she'd need to pick up at work. When I mentioned this to Faye, she immediately offered payment plans and connected us with something called the Educational Justice Fund that helped families in situations like ours. She filled out the application herself, and within a week, they approved partial funding for our legal expenses. Hugh finally made his decision and sent Vaughn a massive encrypted file with complete internal documents, including actual source code, showing how the personality quiz data got integrated into the testing algorithm. He needed someone independent like Isabella to verify everything before it could be published, because he wanted to make sure the technical details were explained correctly. Vaughn forwarded everything to Isabella, who spent 2 weeks setting up a controlled testing environment to replicate exactly what Hugh had described. She recruited volunteer test subjects who hadn't taken the personality quiz and others who had, then ran them through modified versions of the IQ tests using the buggy algorithm. Her results matched our experiences perfectly, with quiz takers scoring an average of 40 points higher when the speed normalization bug was active. She documented everything with video recordings and detailed statistical analysis that proved beyond doubt what had happened to us. With Isabella's verification complete, Hugh felt confident enough to let Vaughn publish everything, including his name, as the source. The next morning, I woke up and checked my phone to find Vaughn's article had gone live overnight, with Hugh's name right there as the primary source. Within hours, the story exploded online, with people sharing it everywhere and major news outlets picking it up. I sat at the kitchen table eating cereal while watching the numbers on the article climb past 100,000 shares. Mom came in and saw me scrolling through comments and asked if I was okay with all this attention again. I told her something weird had happened overnight, because for the first time in months, I didn't care what anyone thought about my test scores. The weight of pretending to be something I wasn't had finally lifted, and I could just be regular Mark who needed help with homework and forgot where he put his keys. 3 days later, we got called to a state education department briefing where officials announced they were sanctioning the testing company and requiring independent verification for all future assessments. The room was packed with reporters and other families who'd been affected by similar testing issues. The department spokesperson read from prepared notes about new oversight requirements, while Faye took notes on every detail. They weren't admitting the state had done anything wrong, but at least they were making changes to prevent this from happening again. A week after that, Faye called to say the Cognitive Enhancement Institute had sent a settlement offer that included what they called a formal apology. She came to our house with the documents and went through every line with a highlighter, making sure they were actually admitting fault and not just expressing vague regret about misunderstandings. The money wasn't huge, but it would cover our legal costs and leave enough for community college tuition. More importantly, they agreed to shut down their testing programs and submit to external audits for 5 years. The school district took longer to respond, but eventually sent a letter agreeing to publicly correct all their statements about my supposed genius status. They removed me from all advanced program requirements and updated their policies about mandatory testing participation. The principal even called to apologize personally, though he still got my name wrong twice during the conversation. Isabella arranged for me to take one final test under completely controlled conditions, with no connection to any previous testing materials. I sat in a plain room with a standard test booklet and answered questions the normal way, without any weird feelings or mysterious intuition. When the results came back, showing I was exactly average academically, Isabella wrote an official report confirming everything we'd been saying about the manipulation. She sent copies to every organization involved and posted her findings publicly so nobody could claim we were making excuses. The media coverage started shifting away from us personally to investigating the broader testing scandal, with reporters digging into other companies using similar methods. Online trolls still popped up claiming we were part of some conspiracy, but I'd learned to laugh at their theories about alien DNA and government mind control programs. Clara messaged me one afternoon with huge news that Vaughn had recommended her for a journalism internship at his paper. She'd written a sample article about her experience with the testing, and they loved her perspective as someone who'd lived through it. Seeing her turn this mess into an actual opportunity made our whole group feel like we were winning in small ways that mattered. Hugh sent an email saying he'd accepted a position with a non-profit focused on testing ethics and accountability. He'd basically destroyed his old career by going public, but found new purpose in making sure nobody else got manipulated like we did. He was already working on proposals for federal oversight of intelligence testing and consulting with lawmakers about closing the loopholes that let this happen. Vaughn's investigative series ended up winning 3 regional journalism awards and got nominated for a national prize in education reporting. At the awards ceremony, he made sure to credit all of us as sources and thanked us for trusting him with our story. The recognition kept pressure on officials to actually follow through with reforms instead of letting everything quietly fade away. Back at home, things slowly returned to something like normal, though we were all tired of talking about IQ tests and genius scores. Dad started helping me look at community colleges with automotive programs since I'd always been good with my hands, even if I couldn't understand calculus. Mom stopped stressing about my grades so much and focused on making sure I was actually learning useful skills. We had family dinners where nobody mentioned test scores or college admissions or anything related to intelligence. My younger sister joked that she was never taking any online quiz ever again after seeing what happened to me. The settlement money came through just in time for spring semester registration at the local community college. I signed up for basic requirements and an intro automotive class that actually seemed interesting. The advisor didn't care about my IQ scores and just wanted to make sure I understood the attendance policy and homework requirements. Walking around campus felt normal in a way that high school hadn't been for months, with nobody staring at me or expecting me to solve impossible problems. Some kids from my high school were there too, and we naturally fell back into our old dynamics of copying homework and complaining about teachers. One girl from my English class said she was glad everything worked out and that she'd never believed I was secretly a genius anyway, because she'd seen my spelling tests. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in months, and I actually appreciated it. The school board meeting happened 3 weeks later, where they voted on new testing rules after our case made them look bad. They passed requirements for written consent forms and independent oversight for any IQ or intelligence testing programs. The policy said no student could be pressured into advanced programs based solely on test scores anymore. Dad sat with me in the back row watching them vote unanimously while reporters took notes. My old principal avoided eye contact when he had to read the new guidelines out loud. The next morning, I drove to the community college to meet with an advisor about actual classes I could handle. She pulled up my real transcript with all those C's and D's, and we talked about basic requirements first. She suggested starting with general education classes and maybe exploring the automotive program since I mentioned liking cars. The meeting felt good because she treated my actual grades as normal instead of some huge disappointment. Nobody mentioned genius scores or wasted potential, which was exactly what I needed to hear. 2 days later, an email popped up from one of the original researchers who'd tested me. She wrote that she knew something was wrong when my academic records didn't match the scores, but stayed quiet. She said she was sorry for not speaking up and understood if I didn't want to respond. I typed back that I appreciated the apology, but didn't really have much else to say to her. The conversation stayed short and awkward, which seemed right for what had happened between us. Faye called that afternoon to say the settlement paperwork was ready for signatures. The amount wasn't huge, but would cover her legal fees, plus leave enough for community college and a decent used car. The best part was no gag order, so we could keep talking about what happened if we wanted. Mom and Dad came with me to sign everything at her office downtown. The whole process took less than an hour with everyone being professional, but clearly ready to move on. I spent the weekend deleting old social media accounts and starting fresh with locked-down privacy settings. My new profiles had no mention of IQ tests or genius scores or any of that mess. I kept it simple with just close friends and family who actually knew the real me. The conspiracy theorists could keep arguing about alien hybrids without my participation. Back at the school, most kids had moved on to newer drama and left me alone. But this freshman girl came up to me near the lockers looking nervous. She said the school had tried to pressure her into similar testing last month. Because of our case and the new rules, she could refuse without getting in trouble. She thanked me for standing up to them, even though it must have been hard. I told her I was glad something good came from all that chaos. That night, I thought about everything while doing homework at the kitchen table. My identity had nothing to do with fake test scores or being special or any of that. I was just Mark who needed gas money and made okay jokes sometimes. Being average felt honest and real, which was worth more than any genius label. The settlement check cleared the next week, so I started looking for cars online. I found an old Honda that needed work, but ran decent enough to get around town. The seller was this retired mechanic who threw in some tools when I mentioned wanting to learn about engines. I spent the next month fixing small things on the car using YouTube videos and the manual. New spark plugs made it run smoother, and I figured out how to change the oil myself. Each repair felt like a real accomplishment, because I actually understood what I was doing. The part-time job at the hardware store covered gas and insurance with some left over for parts. My manager liked that I showed up on time and didn't complain about inventory work. He didn't know or care about the whole IQ test thing, which made work feel normal. The last Saturday of the month, I filled the tank with my own money from my paycheck. The gas gauge showed full for the first time since I'd bought the car. It was such a small thing, but after everything that happened, it felt like the best victory. Normal life with normal problems and normal wins was exactly what I wanted all along. That's my perspective on it. But I always want to hear yours, because the comments are where the real fun happens. Would you have done it differently? Drop a comment and I'll be checking through them.